So I give this class every year for Hanukkah because I think it is a fun discussion. It always ends up being pretty interactive, and it's trying to answer a question that seems to be a pretty basic and simple question, and a question that hopefully all of us assume that we have a clear understanding and answer to, and that is the question of why is Hanukkah 8 days, 8 nights, and 8 days long? Why? Marty, why is Hanukkah for 8 days?
Well, I'm going to get trapped here, but okay, because of the length of time that it took them to prepare and use the oil that lasted for.
Right. God made a miracle that the oil that they found, which was supposed to last for only one day, ended up lasting for 8 days. Now, Marty is 100% correct. That is exactly what it says in the Gemara. The Gemara says, "My Hanukkah." What is Hanukkah? The Tana Rabbanan. Our rabbis taught the following: B'chaf Hei B'Kislev, that on the 25th of Kislev, Yomei de Hanukkah, Tam'ina Inon, that it begins the days of Hanukkah, which are 8 days. Dolol Mispod Bahon, Dolol Anis Bahon. We're not supposed to fast during those days. We're not supposed to eulogize during those days. They're supposed to be happy days, days of Simcha. In fact, the Taz, Rabbeinu David Siegel, who passed away in 1667, actually writes that there's a mitzvah of Simcha and Hanukkah. Aside for the mitzvah of lighting the candles every single night, there's also a mitzvah to be besimcha over Hanukkah. We have to make sure that we're machmer about it, and making sure that we're besimcha over Hanukkah, that we have joy over Hanukkah. So this is what the obligation is. This is what Hanukkah is. And why is that? Why do we celebrate it? Because when the Greeks entered into the temple, Timu kol hashmanim, they defiled, they made impure all of the oil that was inside the temple. Ukeshagavra malchus beis Chashmonai v'nitzchum, and then when the Chashmonaim stood up and fought for our religious rights and won, Badku, they went around searching. V'lo matzu elapach echad shel shemen, they only found one jug of oil, Shahaya Munach Bechosmo Shel Kohen Gadol, that had the seal of the Kohen Gadol that indicated that it was pure olive oil that was never contaminated. V'lo hayabo elo lahadlik yom echad. However, that one jug only had enough to last for one day. Nasubo nes, God made a miracle, says the Gemara. Bedliko mimenu shmona yamim. He made a miracle that it lasted for 8 days. In order, why 8 days? The Ran on this Gemara explains, because they needed it to last for 8 days for there to be enough time for there to, as Marty pointed out, for them to procure more oil. They needed to, the olive groves were up in the north in the region of Asher. We know that Eretz Yisrael was divided into the different Shvatim, all the different tribal lands. Those regions, so the region up north that had the olive groves, that it was the region of Asher. And it was there that they needed to go, which is a 4-day trip there to get the pure oil, then a 4-day trip back to the temple in order for them to use the new pure olive oil. God made a miracle that the entire length of that time that they were getting more oil, they had enough to last for the full 8 days, even though there theoretically should have only been enough for one day. God made a miracle that that one jug of oil that was supposed to last only one day lasted for 8 days. Okay, this is, and then L'Shana Acheres, the next year, Kavim V'asum Yom Tovim B'Halal V'Hoda. Then the rabbis made a decree that every single year, the 25th of Kislev, for 8 days, 8 nights and 8 days, we celebrate Hanukkah. We celebrate this miracle of the oil. Number one, over the fact that we were able to resume service in the temple, and that was hallmarked by the menorah lasting for 8 days instead of just one day. But here is the major problem with this practice. Again, the question is, why is Hanukkah for 8 days instead of, why is Hanukkah for 8 days? So the Gemara just said, because it lasted for 8 days. The oil lasted for 8 days instead of just one day. The Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, 1488 to 1575, he was born in Spain at the age of 4 years old in 1492. as part of the Spanish Inquisition. He escaped with his family due to the Inquisition, traveled through the Ottoman Empire, ended up in the middle of the 16th century, ended up in Svat in the north of Israel. He passed away in 1575 at the age of 83 years old. Rabbi Yosef Karo lived a very long life. He, throughout his journey through the Ottoman Empire, began writing an encyclopedia of Jewish law that was supposed to analyze and explain all of the practices that we have, that we practically do today. Everything that we do today in calendaric law, the laws of daily living, kashrus, mikvah, laws pertaining to the court system, marital law, all the laws that are practical and apply today. This is all discussed in the tour that the Beis Yosef is commenting on and explaining, expounding this whole encyclopedic work. He gives you everything you need to know, starting from the pasuk in the Torah, the original earliest source of this rule, going all the way through all of the Mishnah, Gemara, all of the different commentaries, the Rishonim, the Achronim, everything up until he gives the bottom line psak. This is how we practice. It's an amazing work, but it's a huge encyclopedia. Not everybody has necessarily access to such an encyclopedia. It's not necessarily accessible to every single Jew. So what he did is that he created a review system, an index. It's called the Shulchan Aruch. So this is what the Rabbi Yosef Karo did in order to make the practice of Jewish law something that is accessible to everybody. And this was really accepted by almost all of Klal Yisrael. Only really the only person that really had a problem with him was Rabbi Shlomo Luria, the Marshal, was really the only one that had a problem with the Shulchan Aruch. But it was that everyone really accepted the Shulchan Aruch as the bottom line halacha. The Ramah, Rabbi Yosef Karo, added in annotations to the Shulchan Aruch, where the Ashkenazic customs, where he was speaking from in Krakow, he passed away in 1572. He lived a very short life, unfortunately. He was born in 1530. He only lived for 42 years. He has annotations of the Ashkenazic practice of the Ramah. He added into the Shulchan Aruch, and that's really why the Shulchan Aruch has become the bread and butter in terms of how we practice Judaism. Because no matter who you are, Sephardic, Ashkenazi, everybody looks straight to the Shulchan Aruch to figure out what it is that we need to do. So Rabbi Yosef Karo, in his encyclopedia, when he's discussing right at the beginning of Hilchos Chanukah, he's discussing why it is that we celebrate Chanukah. He quotes this Gemara, and then he has a question. He says, I'm not sure why it is that we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days. The miracle was not an 8-day miracle. The miracle was not an 8-day miracle. There was enough oil to last for 1 day. As it said in the Gemara said, V'lo hayabo ela lahadlik yom echad. They had enough to last for 1 day. So if they had enough to last for 1 day, so then that means that 1 day, day one, was not a miracle. They had enough for 1 day. And the fact that it lasted an additional 7 days, that's something miraculous. Hanukkah should only be a 7-day holiday, not an 8-day holiday. This is the famous question of the Beis Yosef. This question of the Beis Yosef, it's interesting, just as a side note, why it went down, and this has gone down in history as the Beis Yosef's kasha, the Beis Yosef's question related to Hanukkah, why it is that we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days instead of 7 days, being that it was only a 7-day miracle, not an 8-day miracle, because there was enough for 1 day. But there are those that ask the question much earlier than the Beis Yosef. This is already brought down by the Tosas HaRush, the students of the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel of first Frankfurt and Main, and then moved in 1301 to Toledo, Spain, until he passed away in 1327, already had this question that he presented to his students, and it's recorded in the notes of the Russia's students. So we're going back to the early 1300s that already this is brought down as a question. The Chachmei Provence of France also have this question. The Meiri discusses this question. So going back a few hundred years before the Shulchan Aruch, already this question is being brought up, but nevertheless went down in history as the Beis Yosef's kasha. This question of the Beis Yosef has been celebrated as probably one of the most discussed question, if not the most discussed question related to Hanukkah. In fact, this question is discussed so much that there are, I have a book at home that has 100 different answers to this question from the Beis Yosef. I heard from a Rebbe of mine, Rabbi Michael Taubes, who said that he has a book that has 300 answers to the Beis Yosef's Kasha. Next time I go to a farm store in Mea Shearim, I'm sure I'm going to find one that has 1,000 answers to the Beis Yosef's Kasha. This question, very celebrated, a lot of different answers. We're not going to go through all the answers. We're going to go through just the answers the Beis Yosef gives, and then perhaps we'll add on one more at the end. The reason I want to focus on the Beis Yosef's answers is because each of the answers are problematic and have room for discussion. So let's just figure out what is the answer. What is the Beis Yosef answer to this question? Why is Hanukkah for 8 days? It should only be 7 days, being that it was a 7-day miracle. So we'll begin like this. The Beis Yosef says, number one, perhaps what they did, perhaps what the Kohanim did when they found only one jug, they said, listen, it's going to take us 8 days to get, we've done this before. It's going to take us 8 days to get new oil. So here's what we're going to do. What we're going to do is we're going to take this one jug and we'll just split it into 8 equal parts. We'll split it into 8 equal parts so that we'll have the ability to light the menorah for every single day until we get the new oil. That's what the Beis Yosef says, that perhaps that's what the Kohanim did. They split the oil into 8 equal parts, and then God made a miracle each day, that instead of that 1/8 of the jug only lasting 3 hours, it ended up lasting 24 hours. And the next day, instead of it only lasting 3 hours, it lasted again another 24. And it just kept, each day was a miracle in and of itself, because instead of the 1/8 only lasting 1/8 of the amount of time, it ended up lasting the whole amount of time that the menorah needs to be lit for. So every single day was a mitzvah. Now, there's an issue with this answer. It's a pretty basic issue with this answer, and this issue is presented by the Pri Chadash, whose yortzeit was actually today. The Pri Chadash's yortzeit was today. Rabbeinu Chacham Chizkia di Silva, who the Pri Chadash lived from 1659 to 1698. Just before the turn of the century, he passed away. He was an incredible scholar. In fact, his mind was so sharp that many assume that when the Pri Chadash suggests something, it's very difficult to argue with him. Very difficult to argue with him because he's extremely sharp. So he has a very sharp question on the Beis Yosef's assumption over here that they split the oil into 8 equal parts. He says that there's a halacha that's found in the Gemara in Menachos on Daf Peites, that when fulfilling the mitzvah of lighting the menorah in the temple, one must put the requisite amount of oil in the menorah for it to last for one whole day. It's a Gemara that says it, that you have to put the full amount of oil in. You can't put in less than the amount needed. You have to put in the full amount needed. No different than really every other mitzvah. Every other mitzvah, you can't say, you know what, I'm just going to cut my esrog in half, and I'm just going to use half an esrog. My friend doesn't have one. I'm just going to split it with him. No, that's not how it works. You need to, there's a set amount in order to fulfill this mitzvah. So so you need to fill up the menorah all the way. So they didn't have the right to say, we're just going to cut it into 8 equal parts and say that, we'll just light it every day. No, you are going to light the full menorah today. And then what happens tomorrow? Okay, tomorrow we're not going to be able to use pure oil. That's it. That is the first problem of the Pri Chadash. He says that they couldn't have done that because they would not have put less than the requisite amount of oil in the menorah. But then he says, well, perhaps maybe they were relying on a miracle. Maybe they were assuming that God was going to do something miraculous for them, because they'll put 1/8 in. And then we assume that God is just going to create this miracle. And then it happened. So they said, oh, wow, it happened one time. Let's see if it happens another time. And then they did it again, and they did it again. And then God ended up making a miracle every single day. The problem with suggesting such a thing, that 1/8 would have been the requisite amount because they were assuming God was going to make a miracle, is that the Gemara also tells us in Psachim on Daf Tzadi Dalet, Samach Dalet, that Ein Somchen Ala Nes, we are not allowed to rely on a miracle. We're not allowed to rely on a miracle. Now, it is possible to say that, says the Pri Chadash, that perhaps actually they perhaps were able to rely on a miracle in that particular scenario. Why? Because God had just done a miracle for them. God had just done the miracle for them one day before, in having beaten the mightiest army in the entire world. A bunch of small yeshiva guys, just beat the strongest army in the entire world, completely outnumbered, completely from an athletic perspective, from a strategic perspective, from every perspective. They had elephants. There's no way to beat them. And then God made a miracle that they actually beat them. So being that God had just performed the miracle for them, the assumption, perhaps, says the Pri Chadash, is that when you are experiencing miracles, then perhaps you can actually rely on a miracle. That's while you're in that zone, in the miracle zone, you can continue to rely on miracles. That is what the Pri Chadash says. Perhaps that's why the Beis Yosef is assuming that they only put an eighth in, because they actually did have the right to rely on the miracle that God was going to do this for them. The Pri Chadash, though, gives a different answer he gives a different answer that really solves the issues over here in this first assumption of the Beis Yosef. He says that it's not that they put 1/8 in each day, but rather it's that they put the whole amount in day one, but only an eighth burnt. That only an eighth burnt. That God made that God made a miracle in that the oil became more dense. It became it had more mass to it. That the volume was the same, but there was more mass to it in that it was able to only burn 1/8 each day. So they did put the whole amount in. They didn't rely on a miracle. And this is what the Pri Chadash says, that perhaps that's what happened. But let's get to the next answer of the Beis Yosef. The next answer of Beis Yosef is also quite fascinating. The Beis Yosef basically gives the same. He brings it down as two different answers, but it's really the same answer. He says perhaps when they did fill up the menorah the whole way, each night, but here was the miracle. The miracle was they filled it up, and the jug that they were filling it from stayed full. And then the next night, they went to go fill it up, and the jug stayed full again. And every single day, the jug stayed full. So they were filling it up. So on every single day, there was a miracle. Now, or he says that maybe they filled it up and the jug emptied, but every single day after it burnt down, the oil cups in the menorah miraculously just kept refilling up. So the issue with this, with these answers from the Beis Yosef, a very simple issue before we get to the more complicated issue, but the simple issue is that he just shifted the issue. He shifted the question, because the question he had is that day one was not a miracle, being that there was enough to last for one day, and God made a miracle really that was only a 7-day miracle. So with this answer that the jug stayed full, so he just shifted the issue. The issue is no longer a day one issue, it's a day 8 issue, right? That on the last day wasn't really a miracle because there was just enough oil to last for that day, right? So but that's a small issue. That's a small issue. Let's get to the bigger issue though. Saying that we're going to use this assumption that the jug just filled back up, they filled it up, and then the jug just refilled, or it stayed full. So the problem with this answer is that the Torah tells us in Parshas Ba'aloscha, when it comes to the mitzvah of lighting the menorah in the temple, so how is one supposed to fulfill the mitzvah? What kind of oil are you supposed to use? That it says in the Torah that you have to light shemen zayit zach katis lamaor. You have to light pure olive oil that is crushed and does not have any sediments left in it. Pure, perfect olive oil that comes from olives, natural, perfect olive oil. The oil, they poured it out on day one, and then it refilled the jug, yeah? Or the cups refilled. What kind of oil is now being used on day 2 in the temple? It's miracle oil. It's not olive oil anymore. It's miracle oil. What are they using? What miracle oil? Miracle oil. They're using miracle oil. They fill it up, and then the jug stays full. So what's left inside here? It's not olive oil. It's miracle oil. It's God-made olive oil, but it didn't come from an olive. The Torah says it needs to come from an olive. This didn't come from an olive. This came from God. It's miracle oil. So this is the issue that Reb Chaim Soloveitchik had. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Zevin discusses this. Rabbi Yosef Zevin, who is a encyclopedist of more recent years, and he discusses this in Moadim B'Halacha. He quotes Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, who had this issue, that he felt that this cannot be correct, that the jug could not have just been miraculously refilled because they could not have used that oil to fulfill the mitzvah of lighting the menorah in the temple, because that's miracle oil, not olive oil. So how are we going to salvage this answer? We have to defend the Beis Yosef. We have so much hakaras hatov to the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef is the reason why we have such a clear understanding of how to practice halacha today. So all our Shabbos, our Chanukah, our Pesach Sedarim, from the time we wake up in the morning till we go to sleep at night, everything is being given to us, guided to us by the Beis Yosef, by Rabbi Yosef Karo and the Shulchan Aruch. We have a lot of hakaras still. We have to defend the Beis Yosef. How are we going to defend the Beis Yosef? So we'll begin like this. Before we give a defense of the Beis Yosef, we'll point out that that Reb Chaim actually has some precedence to this issue of that this is not called olive oil, this is called miracle oil. What's his precedence? So there's another place in Tanakh, in our Jewish history, where we have a story, a miracle related to oil refilling miraculously on its own. Do you remember the story of the prophet Elisha with the Isha Shunamis, the woman from Shuman, who unfortunately, well, she was a very wealthy woman, but unfortunately she did not have any children. And she was saying this to Elisha, and Elisha gave her a bracha. Elisha would stay by her house, and she did achnas sorchim for him, took care of him, and she was saying, give me a bracha for a child. He gives her a bracha that 1 year later she'll have a child. 1 year later, Baruch Hashem, she had a child. Unfortunately, the child died at a very, very young age. Elisha comes back, and through these very mystical ideas, is able to actually brings the child back to life. One of the things that he tells her in order to bring the child back to life, he says, get everything you have in the house, get all the oil that you have, get all the pots you have in the house, get all the pots from the neighbors, get everything. Well, how much oil do you have? I have 1 jug. Great. Take that 1 jug and pour it in all the pots. And then all the pots filled up. The jug kept refilling. So the Radak on that on Malachim Beis, in that story, says all that new oil, it's fascinating, all that new oil, no tithes needed to be separated from it. No meiser or truma or meiser needed to be given from that oil. Why? Because it was not olive oil. What was it? Miracle oil. It's miracle oil. So Reb Chaim is saying the same thing. This is miracle oil. You can't use that to lighten the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. So how are we going to salvage the answer of the Beis Yosef that the jug refilled miraculously, and they could use that for to lighten the temple? So the Taz, I mentioned the Taz before. Rav David Siegel, he was the head of the Vad Arba Aratzos. That then in Europe there was a committee that oversaw all of the religious communities in Eastern Europe. So the Taz was the head of that committee in the beginning of the 17th century. So the Taz has a commentary on Shulchan Aruch, and he defends the Beis Yosef like this. He says that we have a principle that comes from the Zohar and is discussed by the Ramban, Nachmanides, in his commentary on the Torah. Nachmanides 1194 to 1270, from first Spain, Grodna, Spain, until he moved to Eretz Yisrael at the end of his life. The Ramban, probably the greatest of all Jewish philosophers, he writes, quoting from the Zohar, that since creation, God never made anything ex nihilo. He never made yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. That in creation, God made things out of thin air, right? There was never light before. God created light, right? Before then, there was nothing. There was utter nothingness. There was just God. That's all that existed before creation. Then God created light out of himself, nothing, right? Just out of thin air. God created animals. He created the whole world, water, created all of these things, people, out of nothing, out of thin air. Adam was min Adama, but he created something from nothing. Since creation, at the end of creation, that was the last time God created something from nothing. After that point, all creations that happened were from something that was pre-existing. All people have been created from other people, all animals created from new species through evolution, not something from nothing, from utter nothingness.
What about love?
So that's one of my students asked me about mun also. So I guess it wasn't from nothing. You have to assume it was nothing. It wasn't from nothing. Yeah, you have to assume it. It had to have been that in the same way. All it says in the Torah is, "Hineni mamtir lachem lechem min hashamayim." The God poured down sustenance from heaven. For all we know, it was similar to hail in that it was procured from the whatever nutrients God pulled out of the air, put it together, and then it rained down. So, but this is
oil should be okay.
So hold on. So God created, he didn't create something from nothing anymore. So now, says the Taz, it must be then that there had to have been a little bit of oil left in the jug when it refilled. Why? Because the oil would not have just come from nothing. It wouldn't have just been sprout from thin air. It had to have been an outgrowth of pre-existing oil in order for new oil to come, for God to have made this miracle. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. There is a halachic concept which is discussed in Gemara in Bechoros, Sadaf Hey, and a few other Gemara in Sanhedrin, and a few other places, about a concept called yesh. Yotzi. There's a concept called yotzi, where if you have a product and then you have a byproduct, that byproduct has the same halachic status as its source, as the product it came from. So, for example, if you have an animal that is kodesh, that's holy, that then gives birth to another animal, that animal is kodesh, is holy. It's the byproduct from the original source. If you have, let's say you have a tree. You have a tree. You say that you make a neder. I'm not going to get any benefit from this tree. The tree then produces oranges. Okay. So am I allowed to eat those oranges? Those oranges are yotze. They're a byproduct from the thing that is prohibited to me. The oranges are therefore prohibited to me. So this is the concept of yotze. Byproducts take on the same halachic status as the product that it originated from. The oil that is grown out from the pre-existing oil, again, because God does not make something from nothing anymore, meaning he's creating something from the pre-existing oil, which means that all the new oil that's coming out of it takes on the same halachic status as olive oil. So it wasn't miracle oil. It was olive oil. It was olive oil that was, it was residual olive oil that was brought about through a miracle, but it has the status of olive oil. That is amazing. Absolutely amazing. So like I said, there's many different answers to this question. It's a little bit of a I don't want to use the language, but it's a little bit of a get out of jail free card. The next answer I'm going to give, this is really the get out of jail free card, but it's not given by the Beis Yosef. Those are all the answers of the Beis Yosef, and we've defended the honor of the Beis Yosef. The first answer, instead of them having separated into 8 equal parts, the Pri Chadasha is probably they filled it up all the way and it just burnt only 1/8, or it's that the jug refilled and that new oil has the status of olive oil because it's being procured from pre-existing olive oil that was the remnants of the jug. But there is a get out of jail free card, and that is the she'iltos brought down by the Birkei Yosef. The Birkei Yosef, the Chida, Chacham Chaim Yosef David Azulai, who was an 18th century Sephardic Chacham, also an encyclopedist, probably, I'm sorry, not an encyclopedist. He was a prolific author. He published more than 120 svarim. 120 svarim in his life. That's unbelievable. It's more than Rabbi Sachs. That is, which is hard to beat. That is an unbelievable amount of books. The Chida, the reason why he wrote so many books is actually quite fascinating, because he professionally was a fundraiser. What was he fundraising for? He was fundraising for the new settlement in Israel. Right? At the time, it was very dangerous, and there was mamish. It was a deserted land. They were starting fresh. And he went around to all the different European countries and North African countries and all over the world, collecting money for the communities in Israel. And he would send money to the communities in Israel. So when he would get to another town to go collect money, the first thing he did, first stop was, can you point me in the direction of the library? He would go straight to the library. He'd read and memorize all of the books in the library that he'd never seen before, because you have to imagine, right? That was before before the modernization of the written word, that we had the ability to have svarim like this just at our fingertips. We have huge libraries like this. It didn't exist, right? That you walk into every shul and they have all the same volumes. It didn't exist. So there were these volumes that existed in all these different towns that didn't exist in any of the other ones. He'd go to the library, he'd go to the base medrash, he'd say, and he'd find all the books he'd never seen before, read through them, memorize them, and then while he was traveling to his next stop, he would write commentary on all of the books that he memorized in his last trip. Yes. The Chida is unbelievable. So the Chida has a beautiful commentary. The most learned sefer of the Chida is the Birkei Yosef, his commentary on Shulchan Aruch. So in his commentary on Shulchan Aruch, right over here, where he's discussing this whole question from the Beis Yosef, he says, I found, because the Chida can find these things, not everyone necessarily could have, but he did because he had access to all of it with his amazing memory, that he said that he found in the She'iltos from Rabbi Achai Gaon. So going back to the Gaonic period, we're talking about probably the 9th century, I think. Rav Hai Gaon he was one of the later Gaonim, so we're talking early 10th century, has a halachic work, and he brings down the episode of the Chanukah miracle. The way that the She'iltos brings down the episode of the Chanukah miracle is a little different than the way the Gemara does. Remember, the Gemara said, like Marty said, that they went and they found enough oil to last for one day. God made a miracle. It lasted for 8 days. That was the language of the Gemara we just saw before. The Chida quotes from Rav Achai Gaon, who writes the following. The language that Rav Achai Gaon uses is V'lo matzu ela pach echad. They only found one jug. And then he throws in a word here. Shelo hayabo lahadlik afilu laila echad. That it didn't even have enough to last one night. That one jug they found didn't even have enough to last one night, which means that it was an 8-day miracle, right? So that's the get out of jail free card. He just solved all the issues. Now, I heard from Rabbi Chaim Jachter. He's a Dayan in Elizabeth. He's a major Talmud Chacham in Bergen County in New Jersey. So he said that he once heard from Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, Zatzal, that whenever you have, in literature in general, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein had a PhD in literature from Harvard, in addition to being one of the most accomplished Talmidei Chachamim of the 21st century. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein said that in literature, a general rule is that if you have two texts, one of them is harder to explain and defend, and the other is easier. It's the same text, but two different versions of the same text, and one of them is more is more cryptic and more nuanced and more difficult to explain. It's probably more accurate, because if it wasn't more accurate, then all of the all of the following publications would have fixed those mistakes. If this was just a mistake in text, if the Gemara was a mistake that they didn't have, that they had enough to last one day, but that's a mistake, then the Gemara would have fixed it in the hundreds of other printings that have taken place from its original inception in 550 until we're sitting in the Rabbi Yosef is sitting in somewhere in the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 16th century. It would have been fixed in the many editions of the Talmud from the beginning till then. So likelihood is that the one in the Gemara is more accurate than the She'iltos. That he's the only one that has this version is much more difficult to, even if it does answer all the questions. But if it would answer, he wouldn't have been the only one that had this version, right? Yeah.
So did I just hear you tell me that if a difficult translation survives, it is more accepted as truthful?
Probably, or not necessarily translation, but more difficult tradition. Yeah. Probably. It's not an ironclad rule, but I think that it's hard to imagine that Rav Achai Gon, who says that they didn't even have enough for one day, others would have had this also. Like, why is he the only one? He was probably, his printers probably had it wrong, right? So that's just that's the get out of jail free card. But either way, I think we've solved the question. So we've given 2 out of 100 answers, and it's right now 8:12. So we have only a few more minutes to go to the rest of the 100 answers. Okay, here we go. So just one more answer we'll get to. Just one more answer. This is, I think, a very important, very important answer. We have to keep in mind that Chanukah is really, for all intents and purposes, a yontiv of Thanksgiving, of giving halal v'hodah, as it says in the Gemara. The reason why the rabbis made the whole holiday of Hanukkah is supposed to be a holiday of giving thanks. Thank you, Hashem, for all the miracles that we created. This is what we say in the Al Anisim. Al Anisim, Al Purkan, Al Gavuras, Al Tshus, Al Melchamos, Shasita L'Avotenu Bayamim Hayim. During this time period, you made all these amazing miracles and all these salvations. This is what you did for them. This is what you continue to do for us. And that's the whole purpose of Nisim in general, of miracles, to remind ourselves of the fact that Hashem does these things for us. Is unbelievable. We just have to open our eyes to be able to see all these miracles that Hashem does for us. Like a trip to go get glasses at Costco, that instead of taking you 4 hours, it only takes you 45 minutes. That is a miracle. And you have to thank Hashem for this extra time He's given you in your life. This is really what the message of Hanukkah is all about. So Rabbi J.J. Schachter, Shlita, is one of my rabbis from Yeshiva University. So he has a different answer to the Beis Yosef's question. The Beis Yosef asked that why is the miracle of why is Hanukkah for 8 days? It should only be 7 days. It was a 7-day miracle because there was enough oil to last for 1 day. Says Rabbi J.J. Schachter, the premise of the question is wrong. The premise of the question is that oil burning in a menorah is not a miracle. It is a miracle. The fact that Hashem created the universe in such a way that allows all these things to work exactly the way that they're supposed to work, that's something miraculous. It's something that we cannot take for granted. And therefore, we have Hanukkah for 8 days because there were 7 days of this super miracle, but there was still 1 day of a simple miracle, of a daily miracle, of a regular miracle, of something that we take for granted miracle. The fact that oil burns. When you have to stop, right? After Hurricane Sandy, everybody lost power in New York. I remember for that time, for the next few days, when you walk into a room, after you got power back on, you turn on the lights and the lights go on. The people said, Baruch Hashem, you noticed it. Now, when I walk into a room, I turn on the lights, I don't even think about it, right? People in Texas, this great Texas freeze that just happened last year, right? Imagine people really, for probably some period of time, really felt after that, Baruch Hashem, that we have energy, that we have power. And then as time goes, I don't know how many more people in Texas are still feeling that way. Probably people that are more impacted feeling more and less. But we have to remind ourselves as often as we can that all these things I have in my life that are quote unquote regular and normal and non-miraculous are actually not normal and not supposed to be taken for granted and actually are miraculous. And we just have to stop and say, thank you, Hashem. And that's the answer to the Beis Yosef's Kasha. That's it. That answers all the questions. Yes, day one was also a miracle. Day one was a miracle because because oil burnt. If we were to fill up the menorah with something aside for oil, we filled it up with seltzer, wouldn't burn. That's it, just wouldn't. Filled it up with vinegar, wouldn't burn. Fill it up with oil, burns. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. We have to just take the opportunity. That's what the Rambam writes is the best way to attain Yirat Shamayim, to bring God into your life in more than just being a concept, becoming a reality in your life. You just open your eyes. Just open your eyes and you just take it in. All of these incredible things that God has created and has given you. I mean, we as a generation especially, right? I mean, the fact that I have here a personalized seltzer can. How can I complain about anything? This is unbelievable that that this has been given to me in my life. It's so small, but it speaks volumes about what we have today. It's just amazing. And we have to it doesn't mean that there aren't challenges. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't appreciate those challenges and that those challenges aren't difficult. But we have to remind ourselves as often as we can, all of the gifts that we have in our life. And that is the ultimate message of Chanukah, the ultimate message of the oil. All right. Wish everyone a lichtige Chanukah, be able to appreciate the light that is remaining. We're halfway through. We should be able to appreciate all the light for the rest of the Yontiv and then beyond. I'll close with just one last note. We mentioned before creation of the world. God created light. What was the source of that light? It wasn't the sun, the moon, and the stars. That was created on the fourth day. What was the source of the light? I don't know. God, right? It's just light. That light was in existence in the world throughout that first week of creation. Human mankind, only experienced that light for 36 hours. They experienced it until Motzei Shabbos. Motzei Shabbos, after creation, is what it says in Zohar. That original light was hidden. It's called the Or Haganos, that was hidden again. There is one other light that has resurfaced. That is a light that we do not get benefit from. There's one other light that has resurfaced we don't get benefit from. We see it, but we don't get benefit from it. That's the light of the menorah. It's the light of the menorah. That is the Or Haganos. That original light remanifests itself in the Chanukah candles, in the Chanukiah, as again, light that we can see, but we aren't getting any practical benefit from it. It was experienced by human mankind for 36 hours, that original light. We light 36 candles over Hanukkah. That's amazing. Absolutely amazing. Now, when do we experience that light throughout the rest of the year? Because otherwise it's hidden. But when else do we experience it? So the Pasuk in Mishlei says, Kiner mitzvah v'Torah, through learning Torah or. We light candles for a mitzvah, referencing the menorah, but then Torah is light. That in the same way that we experience those 36 candles, those 36 hours of original light, we can experience it all the time through the study of Torah. Through the study of Torah, that original light resurfaces. How many tractates are there in our oral law, the Gemara? 36 tractates. 36 tractates. 36 candles from the original 36-hour light, that straight light straight from God. God willing, everybody this year should have a year where they're able to experience that true light from themselves, and it's available. We should have to open our eyes, go there, go to the Torah, be able to see it. Amen. All right, the lift of Chanukah, everybody. Good night, everybody.